He's Howard Ibach, former copywriter and creative director, and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love to talk about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. Henry, we have a guest from Manchester, England today. His name is Nick Asbury. He's written an amazing book called The Road to Hell. We're going to talk to him about that and a few other things. Let's join the conversation. Henry, we are back for another episode today. We are joined all the way from London. We have a love of guests from London. Nick Asbury. Did I say your name right, Nick?
You did. I have to immediately correct you, though. I'm actually not in London. I'm in Northern England, nearer to Manchester than London.
Okay. Near to Manchester, same time zone.
Yes,
same time zone. So he's in the UK. There I can't go wrong. And Nick is joining us today to talk about his new book, The Road to Hell. But he has been a direct response and a branding copywriter for a couple of decades or more. And Nick, it's a delight to have you on the Brief Brothers. Welcome.
Thank you, Howard, and thanks, Henry. Yeah, it's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Well, we're honored to have you. We want to talk about your book, The Road to Hell, because you have some very serious things to say about purpose advertising. But let's start at the beginning. What was your path to advertising? How did you find your way to our industry?
Yeah, it was kind of a messy one. I mean, I did a degree in English, and like a lot of people who do that, yeah, well, I emerged having no clue what to do with it. I eventually stumbled into the world of initially kind of direct response copywriting at a couple of long defunct agencies you will never have heard of. But I kind of learned the trade by writing long direct mail pieces for charities, really, kind of asking for money. And it was actually, I still look back on it as one of the hardest forms of writing that I've done, really. And it's quite I guess a good way to learn the trade, because it really is writing, long form writing with a very specific goal and a very measurable goal of raising funds. So I did that for a while, and in the course of doing that, I met a couple of other writers, and one of them was very entrepreneurial and wanted to set up his own company, and I ended up kind of co-running that agency in London, actually, for about 5 years. We grew into a slightly unusual agency. It was called Other, OTHER, but unusual in the sense of being led mainly by writers. But we had a few designers as well and account managers. It was a fairly small agency, about 12, 15 people. But we did a lot of initially direct response work, but broadened out into all sorts of work, really, branding, TV, radio, and it was good fun, but I found I didn't particularly enjoy the kind of running a business side of things, the hiring and firing and pitching for work and the finances, and I found it all pretty stressful, really. So the one bit I enjoyed was the writing and the coming up with ideas. So after about 5 years, I left, and basically ever since then, I've been a solo writer, a kind of writer for hire, mainly in the kind of branding and design world. So I guess the best way to kind of position me in the landscape in a way is if you look at like the D&AD awards, the kind of global creative awards, that my kind of category there is writing for design rather than writing for advertising. So I've kind of chaired the judges in that category, and I've managed to win a few of them over the years. And yeah, writing for design is this slightly kind of nebulous world. It's kind of a combination of all sorts of brand writing, strategy writing, direct response writing. So I've kind of got one foot in that world and one foot in the advertising world, and because it all merges together, I think, at some point. And just to finish, I've always tried over the years to combine the day job with just writing as many other things as possible, from poetry to humorous books to kind of commentary about the industry as well, which is what eventually led me to this book.
Well, just to clarify, because before I hit record, I was telling you that I started off my career in writing long form copy. It wasn't necessarily direct response. It's like collateral, catalog copy.
Mm.
What is the difference between the long form I just described, like catalog copy? Like I wrote a lot of copy for car catalogs before everything went online, and for boating companies describing, beautiful flowing adjective filled copy about how this wonderful sailboat or luxury boat, must be behind your car. You need to go out and buy one right now. What's the difference between?
Your thesaurus was never too far out of reach.
No, exactly. So tell us your perception of the difference between that kind of copy and the direct marketing that you're doing.
I guess, I have done my share of catalogue writing in my time. I actually remember writing the Christmas catalogue for Harrods, the posh shop in London. That was a long and arduous task. This is back in my kind of earlier days. I guess that kind of writing, this was writing probably thousands of short captions about different products and things. I guess that kind of writing is the type that could be, and probably is already being, taken over by AI, in the sense that it can be done to a certain formula, probably pretty effectively. But I think the longer fundraising writing that I did, where, I'm sure you've had experience of this as well, but, I would write these kind of 2 sides of A4 kind of letters. The heaviest charity I guess I worked for was one called the Medical Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture. It was really, dark subject matter and quite difficult to relate. And I think that's the kind of writing that AI might struggle to do, because it really is a kind of craft to be able to tell a story and to be able to ask for money at the end of it without it feeling too exploitative or too crass, or also while feeling different to all the other charity appeals that that people get through their letterbox. So yeah, I guess there are just so many forms of writing and they all present their own challenges.
I asked the question because Henry and I talk a lot about the dearth of training in our industry. It's changing, but there are still, compared to 70s and 80s, there isn't as much fundamental training, and that's reflected in the quality of the writing. And I think very few people have the grounding in long form copy that I think is required to really know how to, like you said, Nick, tell a story, build that story to a sales message, and close with a call to action. And when you master that, as David Ogilvy liked to say, when you master that, then you have the skills in hand to be more pithy and come up with a creative headline. Have you found that to be the case? Do you see this this challenge of young writers coming along who are not grounded in some of these basics?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to some extent it's always been the case that certainly in the advertising world, a lot of writers, the art director and the writer right in their early days argue about who's going to do the words, and whoever's the best at spelling or something gets the writer job. And a lot of brilliant kind of advertising writers, by their own admission, are great at long form copy. They're just good at ideas and writing a headline, and they would actually, as I say, by their own admission, they wouldn't think that they were that great at long form copy. So I think there's always been there's that side of advertising which is quite conceptual and more ideas based, where I think it's perfectly fine not to be a highly accomplished kind of long form writer. But yeah, I think there's also a great tradition of direct response writers who Like Ogilvy himself, going from door-to-door sales to writing ads. I know a previous guest of yours, Steve Harrison, is a real master of direct response writing as well. I'm not sure how Steve learnt his trade. I'm not sure how David Ogilvy learnt his trade. I know I learnt it really just from doing the job. And I
Yeah.
remember in my very first job, I actually had a writer who was the creative director of the agency was a writer, and he was actually a brilliant guy when it came to giving feedback and steering me in the right direction. So I guess that kind of mentoring thing exists in an informal way in the industry. And if you're lucky, you kind of hook up with someone above you who's just good at giving guidance, and you learn by doing, but yeah, I agree. I think copywriting, even more than design, well, much more than design and art direction, it's a very unstructured profession, really. There's no real set way into it. Maybe it's evolving slightly. I know quite a few of the creative colleges in the UK are now offering kind of copywriting courses alongside the design ones, but it's still, it's a pretty small niche. Maybe we'll see it expanding in future.
Some wise soul once said that anybody can write a headline, and as evidence, look at the personalized license plates on many automobiles, which are
Yeah,
can often be very clever.
totally.
But
Yeah.
can you go beyond that license plate? I mean, that's even shorter than Twitter or X.
Mm.
And I think that's kind of a nice, if you don't mind, Nick, I think that's a nice segue into the social criticism that you've been writing. In particular, this book called The Road to Hell. I've got a bunch of questions because I was fascinated in my reading of it. But why don't we just let you summarize what this book is about? Why did you write it?
Mm.
I would say the full title is The Road to Hell: How Purpose. I've got it on my little my iPad right here in front of me.
Good book.
It's called The Road to Hell. How Purpose. There you go. How Purpose leads to a worse world, which is counterintuitive, although it's not.
Yeah.
But I think it's a great title, catchy title. And I've got some questions. I think if I could summarize your book in a sentence, tell me if I've got this, because there are lots of things that I think are compelling. Henry and I like to talk about and have come together because of our commitment to and our passion for the creative brief. And there's some arguments against purpose-driven marketing and advertising. That's how, it makes it harder to write a creative brief if that's your objective. Yeah. But I think if my understanding is that your argument is, I think summarized in the subtitle, purpose, you're pursuing purpose for your brand to try to make the world a better place, and it actually has the opposite effect.
Yeah. And it is a counterintuitive argument. I know it kind of many people do a kind of double take when they see the title. And just incidentally, maybe that does come slightly from the direct response background or the advertising background. You've got to get people in from the headline onwards. But yes, having been a practicing writer, through these last 20 years or so, I saw this movement coming into the industry. I think in the US as much as the UK, maybe around the same time. I trace it really to just after the financial crash of 2008, when I think the reputation of business generally was at a real low, and you had like the Occupy Wall Street protests and lots of bad feeling about the excesses of corporate power and so on. And I think this new movement arose as a response to that, and it was basically summed up in one word, which is purpose. And I think purpose has become this big buzzword in the industry in a way that it just wasn't in the early 2000s, 1990s, or whatever. It was you never had that kind of capital P purpose that we've got now. And I just remember right from the start when this started edging into our industry, I just felt very uncomfortable about it. It didn't feel right to me. Um, it felt like a way for brands and businesses to kind of relax into this very convenient fantasy about how you could do well by doing good. That's the kind of central slogan of the purpose movement. And yeah, it's this idea that if you embrace progressive causes and make that the center of your brand, the center of your marketing, that will lead to greater profits, greater prosperity, and therefore, everyone's a winner. There's nothing to worry about. Ethics are actually an opportunity, they're not a constraint on your business. And you can see that's a very seductive idea, but I think in reality, the way it pans out is there's a lot of businesses just telling these pretty dubious stories. And I'm sure you must have noticed this yourselves. I think the big red flag for me was in 2017 when Pepsi released that Kendall Jenner ad. Do you remember that one? It was it was
We all
kind
do.
of yeah, the concept was kind of around, it was loosely borrowing the aesthetic of a kind of early Black Lives Matter march, and Kendall Jenner breaks off from her photo shoot, joins the march, and hands a kind of Pepsi to the stern-looking police officer, who smiles, and then everything's okay again. Pepsi has solved the social issue. And obviously that was an extreme example, and it got withdrawn the next day after a global outcry.
Well, I think Martin Luther King's daughter's comment
Yes.
was a dagger, maybe the dagger, when she said, too bad Dad didn't know about this when he was alive.
Exactly.
If he'd only had a Pepsi, oh
Yes,
my.
exactly. Yeah, I think that was probably the tweet that that pushed them over the edge. But that's an extreme example, and I think even purpose advocates would say, yes, of course, that's a silly, ridiculous overclaim by Pepsi. But I think there's been so many other ads in that vein where it's the commercial brand trying to connect itself to a social, political cause. And it's always just a very strained link that they're trying to create. Because I think there are purposeful brands and they're non-profit brands. A lot of the brands I started out writing for, and I think if you're a charity or a non-profit, it must be quite weird at the moment to look at the commercial world and all of these deodorants and soaps and fizzy drinks, all kind of claiming the mantle of some kind of social leader of some social movement. It actually
Well,
makes it.
as you pointed out, so I think so clearly in your book, when Hellman's, for example, makes the argument that it's a mayonnaise out to make the world a better place, they had been around for 110 years
Yeah.
without ever having said anything like that. Whereas a nonprofit emerges with that purpose, and without it wouldn't exist. So yeah, I'm sure these nonprofits are scratching their heads saying, well, wait a minute. This is why we came to be, and now a mayonnaise is trying to tell the world that they're doing more good than we are. We're raising money for cancer. We're raising money for education. We're raising money, to end disease. And now a mayonnaise is doing more than we can. What's wrong with this picture?
Yeah, totally. And I think what the mayonnaise will quietly do in order to justify its campaign they will give some money to a charity, who actually does the real work. But all the headlines and all the publicity goes to Hellman's. It doesn't go to the charity. And I think it's a weird inversion of, maybe it sounds hopelessly nostalgic to say this now, but I remember a time when it would be considered incredibly crass and kind of graceless to give money to charity and then go and shout about it and say, look, aren't we amazing? And, you know, and you hardly even mention the charity anymore. You just talk about what a purposeful brand you are. And I think that's what purpose has done to a lot of brands. It's actually just turned them into these blowhards, really.
I,
who
Well,
are-
I'd like to chime in real quick. There's a few
Please do.
facets of this that I love. And I wrote a piece a few years ago actually about this very problem. It's on
Mm,
LinkedIn somewhere. But you know, you mentioned there are brands that are nonprofit brands. There are brands that were established to do good. And the prototypical one that I can think of is Tom's shoes. You buy a pair
mm,
of Tom's shoes, and a pair of shoes goes to someone who doesn't have shoes. And what I said in the piece is the more these fake brands try to create some purpose, the more jaded consumers get. And the
yeah.
people that get really, the brands that get hurt by that ultimately are the real purpose-led brands, the brands like Tom's, because nobody believes anything anymore.
Hmm.
That's one aspect of it.
Yeah.
And why don't people believe it anymore? Well, because you have brands like Audi, and Audi's my favorite example of this. So I don't know if, I want to say it was like 2011, something like that. Audi had a Super Bowl commercial. Uh, I think it was called the Clean Police or something like that. They had, it was about their clean diesel vehicles, and the commercial used the song "The Dream Police" by Cheap Trick, and it showed like this dystopian future world where there were going to be these environmental police that were going to pull you over, and if you didn't have a clean running car, you were going to get harassed, arrested, or whatever. And they were claiming, you know, with their clean diesel technology, you were going to avoid this dystopian future.
Mm,
And it turns out that Audi, as part of the Volkswagen group, was cheating on emissions testing technology the whole time. Uh, and so, and by the way, their tagline at the time was "Truth in Engineering." So, setting that aside, you fast forward several years, and they had another Super Bowl commercial, beautiful film, voiced over by George Clooney, talking about gender equity. And this is when I wrote my piece. I'm like, who is Audi to lecture anybody about anything, especially outside of their domain, which is automobile manufacturing, when within their domain they were caught lying. And in fact, the cheating scandal around Volkswagen and the whole Volkswagen group extended not only to the diesel cars but to the gas powered vehicles as well. And those allegations were coming out when commercial about gender equity was probably being pitched and produced.
mm,
It's like, where do these people get off on lecturing other
yeah.
people? And so that's one thing that really frosts my balls.
Hmm.
And the other is, if you work at an agency or at a client that is adopting some of these views and you don't subscribe to those views, you're being put in a really awkward position, because the company is now subscribed to something that has nothing to do with their line of work, but they're alienating their own employees, their own agency personnel. Like, I recognize that my political views probably are not held by 95% of the people I work with in the ad agency industry. That's okay. But you don't have to rub it in my face all the time and make me feel like an outsider, particularly when the work we're doing has nothing to do with any of that.
Mm,
So I
mm.
think it's unnecessarily divisive.
Yeah. Oh, and I love the you can feel the passion in your voice when you're saying all that. And I think it's so true that this, you know, this is partly what drove me to write about this subject again and again, is it really does anger you sometimes when you see these this kind of moral grandstanding coming from people who just have no right to be putting themselves in that position. Um, and I totally agree that it's counterproductive in so many ways, but because I think when companies kind of declare this is now our purpose, this is now our issue, we're now going to take a lead on this, you're right that the employees of those companies are disempowered, because not all of them, just by the nature of humans and all their diverse views and perspectives, not everyone's going to agree with what the CEO or the CMO has suddenly decided is their stance on some particular issue. And that does leave those employees in a real bind, I think. And then the same happens with consumers, where you kind of just want to get on with your day and buy whichever can of fizzy drink happens to catch your eye first or whatever. And yet the brand purpose movement tries to turn every purchasing act into like a political statement. So you suddenly have to stop and think, God, are people going to think I'm some, I don't know, Trump anti-vaxxer if I pick up a can of, X beer or Y beer? Because it's like, because everyone's trying to position themselves on some spectrum.
I think you made the argument very clearly and compellingly about the misperception that Gen Z is politically motivated and passes that motivate or uses that motivation in its purchase decisions. When you cited the UK poll 3 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine, and I believe 81% of people 55 years and older said that brands should no longer support or should withdraw from the Russian market because of that war. Whereas the 18 to 24 set, only 30 some odd percent said yes to the same question.
Yeah.
So I think the point that you were making was that what people say, or how they answer a pollster and what they actually do are two different things. So they might do their virtue signaling and saying, oh, I'm not going to support X or Y because they don't do these things that I support. But then they'll go to Amazon and buy, or they'll go to Target and buy, or they'll go to Walmart and buy.
In a certain way, I mean, this is what I'm going to forget the name of the author who wrote a book called The Madness of Crowds, which is essentially, I mean, when the war broke out in Ukraine, I remember the retribution against Russian athletes that had nothing to do with the decision that the government, like I couldn't imagine, American athletes or British athletes being discriminated against, being denied participation because of something their government did. To me, it just strikes me as completely absurd and ridiculous. The other a great example of this, pandering to purpose, that was the Gillette "The Best a Man Can Get" film, where basically castigating men as if all men were these depraved, sexual predators. Of course, the film was directed by a militant, progressive lesbian woman trying to sell razors to men by telling them that they suck. Like, the whole thing to me struck me as like absurd and has nothing to do with, and then coming from a brand, by the way, which had done a lot of misogynistic advertising over the decades. Like, it just,
I think that's what really grates with people, I think, because it's one thing, it's perfectly fine to put out there some kind of message about, criticizing masculinity, asking questions about, the way men are or the kind of cultural norms around that. But that might be an interesting point for a particular non-profit or social movement to be making, a valid point which we could then argue about or disagree with. But when it's coming from a razor brand that has built its whole brand on, the best a man can get, and kind of extremely kind of conventional, cliched, masculine tropes, for want of a better word. It just winds people up. You just feel like you're being preached at by someone who's got no right to put themselves on that pedestal.
They're peddling in stereotypes that would never be acceptable to women or to minority groups, or only because it's men and because it's white men. Like, to me, it just is like, why don't we just respect everybody? And if your tagline is "the best a man can get," instead of showing the worst cases of what they were calling toxic masculinity, show the best cases of what is virtuous masculinity, right? Of taking care of others, of being a provider, of being there, of being a support, of being a pillar. That to me would say you understand the target audience, that what they aspire to be, give them something to shoot for, rather than castigating them for, and by the way, labeling half the population of the globe as guilty of something that maybe less than 1% of them actually engage in. It's crazy.
Well,
Yeah, sorry, Howard, I just wanted to pick up on something you said about how all of this actually affects purchasing decisions as well, because and this relates to what you were saying, Henry, about Volkswagen. Volkswagen sales bounced back so quickly after that diesel scandal, and it was a huge story in the UK and Europe. I'm sure it was in America as well. But it is very compelling evidence that people just don't really think about this stuff that much when it comes to buying their next car or their next, filling their next supermarket trolley or whatever it is. We can think of that as a good or a bad thing, but at the end of the day, people are too busy to consider the morals or the ethics of any particular brand. If it's a good car and it's good value and it's easily available, and Volkswagen has been supported by brilliant creative advertising for decades, and I'm sure that helped it bounce back as quickly as it did. But yeah, there's very little evidence that anyone, let alone Gen Z, who are surprisingly human beings just like everyone else, very few of us consider the ethics and the social, the avowed social purpose of any brand when we're making buying decisions. We just don't,
in our industry, in the creative advertising industry, probably the most revered and iconic brand is Apple. And nobody thinks twice about the working conditions at Foxconn or wherever in China. Like, give me a break. Like, it's so hypocritical. Like, this industry loves to pose and pretend. Meanwhile, what we revere is Apple for their creativity, rightly so. But then don't come to me, preaching when the brand that you revere is, actively, engaging in it, because the labor costs are cheaper and, whatever it is. Now, to Apple's credit, they're starting to move a lot of their production away from China into India. That doesn't necessarily make it better, but I feel more comfortable that it's not at least a communist regime where people have very limited freedoms. But I mean, I think the point is people are still going to buy what you were saying. They're going to buy what suits them as a product. Electric vehicles, Tesla. I mean, there's not a more ecologically damaging industry probably than mining for these precious metals that go into these batteries, and the exploitative labor practices because of where these minerals are found are in basically third world countries where there's very little controls. All these things are complex, and consumers aren't going to dive deep into researching all this stuff. So again, I think it just creates a general environment where consumers are just jaded and they can't, they already don't believe advertising, and we're giving them more reason not to believe advertising.
Well, with the comment that I wanted to make, Nick, is, as I was saying to you before we hit the record button, my objective was to skim your book as quickly as I could so I could grasp a few things and ask some questions. And I wasn't able to do that because the book is so well written. It is a combination of erudition, academic substance, and a copywriter's gift at telling a good story. Often laugh out loud funny, brilliant observations. I was gobsmacked on more than one occasion by some of your interesting tidbits and statistics. So I couldn't recommend this book more highly. It is a great argument because it for me, as a former creative and a teacher of creative and a teacher of writing briefs, it does this thing called purpose advertising, and what you have argued makes our jobs as creative brief writers harder. Because as you argue so cogently, when you focus on purpose, brands start to sound the same. Instead of being distinctive. I mean, Henry is a huge fan of Byron Sharp, and I have become, as you know, through his talking about it, and you mentioned it in your book as well, Nick, when he talks about brand distinctiveness and, you know, top of mind, when you start to talk about we are here to do the world good, all of a sudden it goes from talking about you, the customer, how we can help you, to how great it's chest beating. And so as a brief writer and someone who's teaching people to write briefs, how do you make that distinctiveness shine through in the very first part of the creative process, which is the brief? It's making our jobs harder. And I don't, you know, I pity the fool who has to, was that Fraser or Muhammad?
No, that was Mr. T.
Mr. T. I pity the fool who has
Clubber
to
Lang.
sit down. Yeah, who has to sit down and map out some kind of strategy to write a brief that inspires the creatives to solve this problem when everything is starting to sound the same. And that was one of the more powerful arguments, because, you know, that's our remit. Henry and I love to talk about briefs. But when I read that, I said, yeah, that is just so, it's so obvious, but we're missing it. We're missing it.
Yeah. And I think the irony is that I think in the early days of purpose, one of the reasons that ad agencies embraced it so eagerly was, at that point, it probably felt like a way to make the brief more interesting. You know, if you were selling soap or shampoo or you know, a fizzy drink, rather than having to talk about smooth skin or, you know, good value or whatever it was, you could suddenly do an ad about, you know, feminism or about, you know, social justice in some way, and it turned those what traditionally might have been more challenging briefs into actually a kind of charity brief, where you could actually do a emotive ad that was much more maybe satisfying for the creatives involved to begin with. But I think the way it's evolved over the years is that every brand has kind of crowded into that space, and every brand is now talking about, you know, we're here to make the world a better place, and they've all struck this same kind of tone, and it's very high flown, very abstract, very you know, if you, in the book, I list the purpose statements of some of the big brands over the last few years, and they're all, you would never know what they did from the purpose statement. It's all just, you know, we're here to inspire the human spirit. We're here to elevate the world's consciousness, and you eventually realize.
And could you name the brand?
Could be written by AI.
Yeah,
right?
exactly,
Like
exactly.
Yeah.
I do an exercise. I used to do an exercise in my workshops where I called it the Einstein challenge, because Einstein is supposed to have said, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. So I said, explain your brand to a 6-year-old. Don't explain the product. We all understand what the product is, but explain your brand. And by your rationale, by your argument, all of these statements would end up confusing the customer, because if you say, you know, we make the world a better place, which brand is saying that? If that's the brand's claim to fame, what brand is it? We don't know, because it has nothing to do with the brand. It has to do with something outside the brand.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
So that misnomer, plus I thought your brilliant observation that we're moving away from saying you to we was incredibly powerful. I mean, that's one of those things that we as advertising folks who are focused on clear messaging. You know, George Bernard Shaw was famous for having said, the problem with communication is the illusion that it actually happens. When you're moving from you talking directly to someone, and Howard Gossard said, I don't know how to talk to everybody. I know how to talk to somebody. You know, going from you to we, it's like, all of a sudden it's like, I'm doing the royal wave.
No,
who am I talking to?
Yeah, I think purpose does just naturally push you towards thinking about yourself more than the audience. And I've actually, you know, been dragged into some of these processes sometimes where brands are trying to identify their purpose, and it's such an extended navel gazing kind of exercise that goes on for months. And it
I hope
leads to
you're
the
well paid at least.
well, you know, I try my best, yeah, but they yeah, it results in these statements like, we believe this, our values are this, you know, we're leading the conversation about this. And there's very little talk of you and what you believe. Um, and it's one of the reasons actually, and this relates obviously to the core of your whole podcast, I guess, is the reason I prefer the word proposition to purpose is, and you know, to make a nerdy linguistic point, they stem from the same Latin root, I think. But proposition is something you put out into the world in order to get a response. You want to see what people say back, you know. So you say to the customer, hey, here's a proposition for you. You know, we can you know, whatever it is, give you a smoother shave than any other razor out there. And then the consumer replies, and you know, you're interested in what they've got to say about it. But purpose is just this kind of inscription on stone. It's just like, this is our purpose. And you're not interested in any kind of response back. You're just like, you know, we've said it now. That's our purpose. And it has a grandiosity to it, which I think is just entirely misplaced. Because the other good thing about proposition is you can change it over time. You know, if the market conditions change, if some new competitor is challenging you or something, you can change your proposition and tweak it, and you know, say different things at different times to different audiences. But purpose is just this really heavy claim that weighs down a brand, and
A ball and chain.
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Millstone. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
there's an old saying in our business, the best way to kill a bad product is with good advertising.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
and if you haven't got a proposition that you put out, because you want to test it. It's like, what do they
Mm,
think? Does it taste
mm,
good? Does it feel good? Do I look
mm.
good in it? And the
Yeah.
answer is either yes or no, or you know,
I want to
but
go ahead. I just wanted to delve into another aspect of this, which is the people who are making these decisions. So I think it's fair to say that advertising since the late 50s, early 60s, the agency industry, so like people like me that work at agencies, fair to say the personality type that has been attracted to advertising has been pretty consistently, you know, more, I guess I'd say left of center, progressive minded. It's the nature of the business. This is an artistic endeavor that attracts creative people, and they tend to have that philosophy. And I think there used to be more tension between the clients and the agencies in that regard, because clients tended to be blue collar companies with people that were more conservative in nature, etc. But something happened in the ranks of the marketing personnel at the clients that began to adopt these things and accept them. And I've got to believe, in a way, they're embarrassed to say, I sell razor blades
Mm,
or I sell widgets. And so, therefore, in order to be at the cocktail party and sound more important and more, they have to say, well, I work at such a place, and our mission, our purpose is to make the
mm,
world a better. Like, it just seems like way too grandiose, but I think it's because the people have changed, where I think it's becoming more homogenous in terms of. I think we've
mm,
seen it in newsrooms, and like where newsrooms used to be very working class places. Now they're very educated, and at least in the United States, there's certain journalism programs that basically inject every. So it's a very homogenistic way of thinking,
mm,
and there's nobody there to check them and say, "Hey guys, the whole rest of the world doesn't necessarily think the way you do."
mm. Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it relates to your kind of madness of crowds point as well, where there's a certain just group psychology that kicks in, where you've got the marketing department who are pushing this purpose idea, and you've got the ad agency pushing it. And even if there are individuals on both sides who kind of think, is this really right? You know, it's actually quite difficult for them to uh, speak up and say so, because there's a moral valency to the whole thing. So it kind of, you can very easily sound like some reactionary kind of person who thinks that, you know, whatever the social issue is doesn't matter, you know, because you're saying, oh, I don't think we really should like base our marketing on this. So I think that has contributed to this sense that purpose is this you know, thankfully more people are questioning it these days, I think, but I think for a while that contributed to it being this dominant blob in a way within within the marketing world that was hard to question.
What
I want to switch to a more positive note at some point, but please go on, Henry.
I
No,
wanted to
no, I'm
ask
done.
you, what's the reaction been to your book? What are people saying to you about it?
Oh yeah, it's been really good. I think, you know, a lot of people, I've had really fascinating correspondence from some people who have been part of these you know, very high profile purpose driven companies, and they've written to me with kind of confessional stories about what a toxic culture it was internally, and how yeah, they were never happy with it. And yeah, so I've had a lot of people feeling relieved that, you know, some of these arguments are out there. Not that I'm the first to make them. You know, Steve Harrison has made a lot of brilliant arguments as well, and other people over the years. But yeah, I get some of that. I get other people who I guess are more in the middle of the spectrum, who are kind of purpose supportive in a genuine way, but find a lot of the criticisms thought provoking, and it kind of changes their view slightly. But I've had my share of kind of outrage as well on LinkedIn and social media, where only a handful really of people, but quite vocal people, have just immediately led to the conclusion that I'm some kind of uh, what would be the word, deplorable type right wing, you know, guy who just wants to drag us all to some future where business just doesn't care at all about morals and ethics, and just concentrates on profits at all costs. And you know, they see, I guess, the argument of the book as a kind of threat to that purpose prevailing order that's there at the moment. So I've had a bit of vitriol directed my way as well. But I wouldn't want to overdo that. That's only been about 5% of the response, really.
Well, I mean, outrage on social media, that's a tautology if I ever heard one,
Yeah.
you know.
And you know, I can't
Uh,
complain when it is a provocative book title, and I'm, you know, I'm
yes.
a provocative argument, so you know, that's totally fine.
Yeah, it's welcome. Have you changed your mind about any aspect of your argument since the book has been out and since you've heard from people?
I wouldn't say change my mind, but I think, you know, every conversation I have about it kind of deepens the argument, and it gives me a kind of, you know, more nuances and more gaps that I fill in. So yeah, I guess in some ways I've found more to bolster my argument than otherwise, really, because as I say, people do approach me with stories about their own inside perspective on this stuff, and I kind of think, God, I might have got even harder on some chapters if I'd known some of this stuff. But yeah, I guess I just want to say, because I know we're in danger of like sounding maybe like three cynical blokes kind of complaining about the way things used to be or whatever, but I just think ultimately I would like to think the message is a positive one, that because I know a lot of younger marketers they kind of think, oh, surely there's a way to kind of make the world a better place using our skills, and you know, and I would say to them, yes, there is, and a big part of it is using those creative skills on behalf of non-profits and your favorite political causes and political parties or community organizations and so on, you can do brilliant work for all of those people. But yes, you can also help Gillette sell more razors, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's people need razors. When businesses do well, they employ people. Those people can then support their families, which helps support entire communities. These businesses pay their corporate taxes. Hopefully they do, which contributes to all the public services we need. And yeah, businesses just generally through competitive markets, they drive innovation and they give people things that they want and need. And that's a perfectly, noble thing in the vast majority of cases. And I just think if you're going to be in the marketing world and the advertising world and you're going to work for commercial clients, you do need to get comfortable with that idea that it's okay to sell stuff, and actually that
Yes.
does have positive social benefits. As
And
long
I think that it's an interesting point, because I think the Overton window has shifted so much that the word capitalism has become basically an insult. It's a bad word. I like to talk about the free market. In our system, right? Nobody tells me who I have to work for. I can buy the products that I want. It's a free market. I buy the products that I find value in, and the ones that I don't find value in, I don't buy. The alternative is a system where somebody else is making that decision for me. Either I have to work at a place, or only X products can be made. There's only, I remember Bernie Sanders saying that there's way too many brands of toothpaste. Well, who's going to be the czar that says how many brands of toothpaste we should have? I would prefer for the market, meaning people, to determine that. And the ones that have shitty toothpaste will become extinct, and the ones that have toothpaste people want will continue to succeed. There's one last anecdote I'll leave you with, and I refer to it often. I read a piece on Facebook. It's an Argentinian creative director, world-known creative director, and he was celebrating an anniversary in the advertising industry. And he gave this anecdote of one time early in his career where he was brought to the Nestle factory in Argentina, Buenos Aires, to take a visit with the agency. There's a new client for them. And the factory manager says, "Who's responsible for the creative here?" And he meekly raises his hand. He says, "I am." He's like, "Let me take you." And he takes him into the room where they're making the ice cream. This is an ice cream plant. And the people are in there working, making the ice cream. And he says, "These people all are employed by us. There's one shift. If you do a good campaign, we'll be able hire a second shift of workers that'll come in here, and if you do a fantastic campaign, we'll have 3 shifts running around the clock making ice cream, and we'll be able to employ 3 times as many people." He said, "Don't let people tell you that what you do is trivial. What we do is important. We help within this market of free market where people are voluntarily buying other people the work and the service of other people voluntarily. We help to promote that. That's what we do. It's not trivial."
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
Nick,
well
I want to
said.
give you a chance. I want to give you a chance to talk about you as we wrap up our conversation. You have something happening in November, and I wanted to give you a chance to promote was it a talk, an interview? Tell us more about this.
Yeah, it's one of the advantages of writing a book is not that you don't get rich by writing books, but you do occasionally get invited to interesting places. So I've been invited to Toronto to the Design Thinkers Conference, it's called, which I think is a pretty major one. I think a few thousand people attend it, and I'll be giving a talk that's mostly about this book, November the 7th, I believe, in Toronto. So if you look that up online, I can't tell you the link off by heart, but I'm sure you'll find it via Google. And if you're in the Toronto area, then please do come along. And if anyone else wants to invite me to some glamorous part of the world, I'll drag myself out there.
Well, you sent me the link. We'll be sure to include that link with our promotional materials on when we post this episode, which will be in the next couple. It'll be this month in October, so well in advance, and others will have a chance to attend. Nick Asbury, author of The Road to Hell, How Purpose Leads to a Worse World. Thank you for joining Henry and me on the Brief Brothers. It's been great having you.
Yeah, it's been great to
Thank
be
you.
here. Interesting conversation. Thanks, both of you.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Ibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye bye.